Right now, something is happening in Washington that most people aren't fully paying attention to yet, but it could shape the future of American war powers for decades. Imagine this for a second. The United States is involved in a military campaign against Iran. Bombs are being dropped. American troops are in harm's way. Oil markets are shaking. Protests are erupting across the country. And yet the branch of government that the Constitution specifically gave the power to decide whether America goes to war just stepped aside. And here's the part that should stop everyone in their tracks. Congress had the chance to stop it. They had the vote. They had the constitutional authority, and they chose not to use it. In the Senate, lawmakers voted 53-47 to block a war powers resolution that would have forced President Donald Trump to either seek congressional approval for the military strikes on Iran or halt the operation. Every Republican senator except one voted against the resolution. The lone Republican who crossed party lines was Rand Paul. Then, over in the House of Representatives, a similar effort also collapsed barely. The vote there was 219-212. Just 7 votes separated Congress from potentially forcing a debate about whether this war should even continue. 2 chambers, 2 opportunities, 2 moments where Congress could have asserted its constitutional role in deciding when America goes to war. And both times they declined. At the exact same time this was happening inside the Capitol, something very different was happening outside it. Crowds were gathering in Washington. Protesters were assembling near the White House. Anti-war demonstrations were spreading across cities around the country. Inside the marble halls of Congress, votes were quietly protecting presidential war powers. Outside those walls, people were demanding accountability. That contrast tells you everything about the moment the United States is living through right now. But to really understand what just happened, you have to step back for a moment and look at the law that triggered this fight in the first place. Because the vote that just failed wasn't some radical political stunt. It was based on a law that has existed for more than 50 years. Back in 1973, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Congress passed something called the War Powers Resolution. It was designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation from happening again. The law requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours whenever American forces are introduced into combat. It also places a hard limit on how long those military operations can continue without congressional approval. If Congress does not authorize the action within 60 days, the president is supposed to withdraw the forces. The whole purpose of the law was to reinforce a simple constitutional principle. Under the U.S. Constitution, the power to declare war belongs to Congress, not the president. That design wasn't an accident. The founders had studied the history of European monarchies where kings could drag entire nations into catastrophic wars with nothing more than a personal decision. They wanted to prevent that kind of concentrated power in the American system, so they divided authority. The president would command the military, but Congress would decide when wars begin. In theory, that system forces debate. It forces accountability, and it ensures that the decision to send Americans into battle requires broad political support. But in practice, things have slowly drifted away from that framework. Presidents from both parties have increasingly launched military operations without formal declarations of war. Congress has often complained about it. Lawmakers regularly deliver fiery speeches warning about executive overreach. Yet, when the moment arrives to actually enforce their authority, Congress frequently backs down. That pattern repeated itself this week in dramatic fashion. The resolution brought before the Senate was simple. It would have required President Trump to either obtain congressional authorization for the military strikes against Iran or stop them. Nothing more, nothing less. But when the votes were counted, the resolution failed. 53 senators voted to block it. 47 voted in favor. And with that vote, the Senate effectively decided not to use its constitutional power to challenge the president's authority over the war. What makes the vote even more revealing is how cleanly it split along party lines. Every Democratic senator supported the resolution. Every Republican senator except Rand Paul opposed it. Rand Paul's vote wasn't surprising to people who have followed his career. He has consistently argued that Congress, not the president, should control decisions about war. His position has remained largely the same regardless of which party holds the White House. But his vote also highlighted something deeper. It showed that concerns about presidential war powers still exist within the Republican Party. They just aren't strong enough, at least right now, to overcome political pressure to support the president. And that political pressure is enormous. For many lawmakers, opposing a president from their own party carries serious risks. It can trigger primary challenges. It can anger party leadership. It can cost committee positions and political influence. So even if some senators privately worry about the constitutional implications of an unauthorized war, they still face a difficult calculation. Do they defend Congress's institutional authority, or do they protect their political careers? The vote suggests that most Republican senators decided the safer option was to stand behind the president. And that decision has real consequences, because what's happening in Iran right now is not a minor military operation. It is an expanding conflict that has already produced casualties, destabilized a major oil transit route, and triggered international condemnation. American lives are at risk. Regional tensions are escalating. Global markets are reacting. Yet the branch of government responsible for declaring war has not formally approved the conflict. That reality is what drove Democrats to push the war powers resolution in the first place. They argued that allowing a president to conduct a large-scale military campaign without congressional authorization undermines the constitutional balance of power. During Senate debates, several Democratic lawmakers warned that the country was drifting toward the kind of unchecked executive authority the founders explicitly tried to prevent. But when the speeches ended and the voting began, the numbers told a very different story. The system, at least for now, is protecting the president's ability to continue the war. And that's only half the story, because over in the House of Representatives, another vote revealed just how fragile that support might actually be. The margin there was razor thin. 219 votes to block the effort, 212 votes to support it. 7 votes separated the House from potentially forcing a major confrontation over the war. 7. That tiny margin is important because it shows that support for the president's war powers may not be as solid as it looks from the Senate vote alone. If just a handful of lawmakers had changed their positions, the outcome could have been very different. And that's where the political pressure outside Washington begins to matter, because while lawmakers were casting votes inside Congress, protests were spreading across the country. Anti-war demonstrations were forming in major cities. Activists were gathering outside the White House. Protesters were interrupting Senate hearings, and the images from those demonstrations were starting to circulate across social media and television screens nationwide. History suggests that movements like this often begin quietly. At first, they are small, they are dismissed, they are ignored. But if a war drags on long enough, and if the human and economic costs become impossible to ignore, those movements can grow into something much larger. And when that happens, the political calculations inside Congress can start to change very quickly. Right now, the protests are still in their early stages, but the ingredients for a much bigger confrontation are already in place. A controversial war, a divided Congress, rising casualties, economic pressure from global oil markets, and a growing movement demanding answers. Put all those pieces together, and the situation unfolding in Washington suddenly starts to look far more unstable than the vote counts alone might suggest. Because those votes didn't settle the debate, they only postponed it. And if the conflict with Iran continues to escalate, the political battle over who controls the power to wage war in America may just be getting started. As if the war debate wasn't already intense enough, another crisis was unfolding at the same time inside Washington. The federal government had entered day 8 of a shutdown, and the atmosphere on Capitol Hill had become explosive. Tempers were flaring, cameras were rolling, and lawmakers were confronting each other directly in the hallways of Congress. What people saw that day was something rarely visible to the public: raw political tension spilling out into the open. Members of Congress were arguing face to face, pointing fingers, raising their voices, and accusing each other of hypocrisy as reporters rushed to capture every second. One of the heated exchanges involved House Democratic leader Hockey Jeff confronting Republican lawmakers about the shutdown and the decisions that led to it. Nearby stood Republican Representative Mike Lawler, who quickly fired back. The exchange escalated rapidly. One side accused the other of hypocrisy for voting to shut down the government after years of warning that government closures were unacceptable. The other side accused their opponents of political theater and grandstanding for the cameras. And standing at the center of the storm was the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who suddenly found himself defending decisions that were drawing criticism from both sides of the aisle. The confrontation captured something deeper than just partisan bickering. It showed how deeply fractured Washington had become at the exact moment the country was also facing a major international conflict. Think about the situation for a moment. The United States was conducting military operations against Iran. Congress had just voted not to enforce its authority over that war, and simultaneously the federal government was partially shut down. The institutions that are supposed to manage crisis were themselves locked in crisis. Inside the Capitol's marble corridors, reporters described the atmosphere as electric. Lawmakers moved quickly between meetings, sometimes stopping to exchange sharp words with political rivals. Staff members hurried through hallways, clutching briefing documents. Television cameras waited around corners, hoping to capture the next dramatic moment. At one point during the confrontation, accusations began flying about who was responsible for the shutdown. One lawmaker demanded to know why the other side had voted to close the government after years of warning about the dangers of doing exactly that. Another responded by saying the accusation itself was embarrassing. The exchange turned personal. "You're embarrassing yourself," one voice snapped. "No, you're the embarrassment." The other replied, "Moments like that may sound dramatic, but they reveal something important about how politics actually functions in Washington. When multiple crises collide at the same time, political pressure intensifies, lawmakers become defensive, alliances shift, and debates that might normally stay behind closed doors suddenly spill into public view. But while the government shutdown was dominating headlines, the much bigger constitutional issue was quietly developing in the background: the war and the question of who actually controls the power to wage it. To understand why that question matters so much, you have to go back to the design of the American Constitution itself. When the founders gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the Constitution, they spent an enormous amount of time debating how to divide military authority between the branches of government. They had a clear historical example in mind: European kings. For centuries, monarchs had been able to drag their countries into wars simply because they wanted to expand territory, defend honor, or settle personal rivalries. Entire nations paid the price for decisions made by a single ruler. The founders wanted to avoid repeating that system, so they built a structure where the power to declare war belonged to Congress, the branch of government closest to the people. Meanwhile, the president would serve as commander-in-chief once a war had been authorized. This arrangement forced political consensus before military action. It ensured debate. It required lawmakers from different states and different parties to weigh the consequences before American troops were sent into battle. But over the centuries, that system slowly began to erode. Presidents discovered that they could initiate military actions without formally declaring war. Congress often complained, but rarely pushed back hard enough to stop it. The pattern repeated again and again. Military interventions would begin. Congress would debate them. But formal declarations of war became increasingly rare. By the time the Vietnam War reached its devastating peak, millions of Americans began asking a simple question: how had the country ended up in such a massive conflict without a clear declaration of war? That question led directly to the passage of the War Powers Resolution in 1973. The law was Congress's attempt to reassert its constitutional authority. It required presidents to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing troops into hostilities. It also created the 60-day clock that forces presidents to either obtain authorization or withdraw forces. In theory, the law was supposed to prevent exactly the type of situation unfolding today. Yet this week, when Congress had the chance to enforce that law, the effort collapsed. The Senate blocked the resolution, the House narrowly rejected a similar measure, and the president's military campaign continued. For critics of the war, the implications are alarming. They argue that if Congress refuses to enforce the War Powers Resolution now, it sets a precedent that could weaken the law permanently. Future presidents could simply point to this moment and say, Congress had the opportunity to stop a war and chose not to. That precedent matters because once a precedent becomes established in Washington, it slowly transforms into a new political norm. And norms are powerful. They shape how future leaders interpret their authority. They influence how courts view executive power. And they determine how Congress responds the next time a president launches military operations without approval. Supporters of the president see the situation differently. They argue that the commander-in-chief must have flexibility to respond to threats quickly, especially in a volatile region like the Middle East. In their view, requiring lengthy congressional debates before military action could limit the country's ability to defend itself. But critics respond with a fundamental question. If Congress doesn't decide when the country goes to war, who does? That question is now echoing through Washington. And it's not just being debated inside government buildings, it's also being shouted in the streets. Because while politicians argue about procedure, protesters across the country are focusing on something far more immediate, the human cost of war. And that cost is beginning to appear in reports, leaked documents, and casualty figures that are slowly making their way into public discussion. Those reports are fueling the growing protest movement that's beginning to challenge the political status quo surrounding the conflict. At first, the demonstrations were relatively small. A few hundred people gathered outside federal buildings. Some activists held signs calling for an end to the strikes. But as the conflict continued, the crowds began to grow. Rallies started appearing in multiple cities. Activists began coordinating demonstrations outside the White House. And in Washington itself, protesters began interrupting congressional hearings, forcing lawmakers to confront the anti-war message directly. That kind of disruption signals something important. It means the movement is moving beyond symbolic protest. People are willing to risk arrest to force attention onto the issue. Historically, that shift often marks the moment when political pressure starts becoming harder for elected officials to ignore. And history provides a powerful example of how that pressure can evolve. During the early years of the Vietnam War, anti-war protests were initially small and easily dismissed. Many politicians mocked the demonstrators and assumed the movement would fade away, but it didn't. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the protests expanded dramatically. Universities became centers of activism. Millions of Americans took to the streets. Economic disruptions began affecting daily life. Eventually, the political pressure became impossible for Washington to ignore. Lawmakers who once supported the war began changing their positions. Public opinion shifted, and the conflict that once seemed politically untouchable became one of the most controversial wars in American history. Right now, the protests surrounding the Iran conflict are nowhere near that scale, but the early stages of the same pattern are visible. Small demonstrations, growing attention, increasing intensity, and the possibility that continued casualties and economic disruptions could accelerate the movement's growth. That possibility is exactly what some lawmakers in Washington are quietly watching. Because if the protests expand and if the war continues to generate casualties and economic consequences, the delicate political balance that protected the president during this week's votes could begin to shift. And if that balance shifts even slightly, those razor-thin margins in Congress suddenly become very important. 7 votes in the House, 6 votes in the Senate. That's all it would take to change the outcome, which means the story unfolding right now isn't just about what happened this week. It's about what might happen next. And the next phase of this story could depend on something far less predictable than congressional procedures: public pressure. Because in American history, sustained pressure from citizens has often been the force that eventually compels Congress to act when institutions alone fail to do so. Right now, that pressure is building slowly, but every week the war continues, the stakes rise, and the political consequences grow harder to contain. As the war debate continues to intensify, the numbers from those votes in Congress are starting to look more and more significant. At first glance, they might seem like just another set of routine political tallies. 53 to 47 in the Senate, 219 to 212 in the House. But those numbers tell a deeper story about how power is actually functioning in Washington right now. Start with the Senate vote. 53 senators voted to block the War Powers Resolution. That decision effectively prevented Congress from forcing the president to justify the ongoing military campaign against Iran. It also signaled that the majority of the Senate was unwilling to confront the White House directly over the issue of war authority. But what's particularly striking about that vote is not just the outcome, it's the pattern behind it. Every Senate Democrat supported the resolution. Every Republican except one voted against it. That lone exception, once again, was Rand Paul. His vote illustrated something that many constitutional scholars have been pointing out for years. Concerns about presidential war powers often cross ideological lines. Some conservatives have long argued that allowing any president, Republican or Democrat, to conduct wars without congressional authorization risks weakening the balance of powers that the Constitution was designed to protect. Yet, despite those concerns, the rest of the Republican caucus remained firmly aligned with the president. That alignment reflects one of the most powerful forces in modern American politics, party loyalty. Over the past several decades, Congress has become increasingly polarized. Party identity now shapes many political decisions that might once have been determined by institutional interests. Lawmakers often feel stronger pressure to defend their party's president than to defend Congress's own constitutional authority, and that's exactly what appeared to happen during this vote. Many Republican senators may genuinely believe the president has the right to conduct military operations without congressional approval. Others may have deeper reservations, but chose not to challenge the president publicly. Whatever their motivations, the final result was the same. The Senate stepped aside, and that decision has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate conflict with Iran. Because every time Congress declines to enforce its authority over war powers, it quietly strengthens the precedent that presidents can act alone. Precedents accumulate over time. They shape expectations. They influence how future presidents interpret their powers, and they gradually shift the balance of authority between branches of government. That's why constitutional scholars often pay close attention to moments like this. Even when the public debate fades, the institutional consequences remain. But if the Senate vote suggested strong support for the president, the House vote told a slightly different story. 219 members voted against the measure that would have challenged the war. 212 voted in favor, a margin of 7 votes. 7, that's an extraordinarily narrow difference in a chamber with 435 members. And narrow margins matter in politics. They reveal underlying divisions that might not be visible in broader headlines. In this case, the narrow vote suggests that some Republican lawmakers may already be feeling pressure over the conflict. That pressure is coming from multiple directions. Constituents back home, economic concerns tied to global oil markets, and growing questions about the long-term consequences of the war. Reports circulating inside Washington suggest that civilian casualties are already becoming a major issue in the political debate. One leaked document mentioned more than 200 civilian deaths connected to the early stages of the conflict. Numbers like that have a way of reshaping political conversations. They appear in news headlines. They spread across social media. They become the focus of protests. And eventually they begin appearing in campaign debates. For lawmakers representing competitive districts, those numbers can create serious political risks. Supporting a war that becomes increasingly unpopular can quickly turn into a liability during the next election cycle. That's why the 7-vote margin in the House is so significant. It suggests that only a handful of lawmakers would need to change their positions to produce a completely different outcome if the issue returns for another vote. And there's a very real possibility that it will, because wars rarely remain static. They evolve, casualty figures rise, costs increase, political pressure intensifies. Every new development can shift the calculations lawmakers use when deciding how to vote. Right now, many Republicans appear to believe that supporting the president is the safer political choice. But if the conflict continues to generate controversy, that calculation could change. And if it changes for even a small number of lawmakers, the balance of power in Congress could shift quickly. That's where the protest movement becomes especially important. While protests haven't yet translated into immediate legislative action, they serve another crucial purpose. They keep public attention focused on the issue. They remind lawmakers that voters are watching, and they gradually build the political pressure that can force reluctant politicians to reconsider their positions. We've seen this pattern before. If you want clear, powerful breakdowns of global politics, war strategy, and the hidden forces shaping world events, make sure you subscribe to BCC News, turn on notifications, and stay ahead of the story before everyone else catches up.